Tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning and welcome everyone. Our first business this morning is the submission of Meridian Energy, and I think Mr. Christiansen's going to speak first.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Yes, my name is Stephen Christensen. I'm counsel for Meridian Energy Limited in relation to this matter. I've prepared some legal submissions which were filed last week, and I hope that the Commissioners have had the opportunity to review them.
Yes, we have, and thank you very much for sending them in advance. That's proved to be efficient. Thank you.
So I'm really in your hands as to whether you would like me to provide a summary of the points I cover. I presume you don't want me to read the submissions, or alternatively, if you just want to go straight and ask me any questions, I'm in your hands.
Well, unless there's something further you wanted to add to the material that you've already given us in writing, I don't think we need to trouble you further at that stage. Do either of my colleagues wish to ask any questions of Mr. Christiansen about his submissions before we come to the evidence?
Not from me, David.
No, nor from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Christiansen, we do appreciate your having given us your submissions in writing, and we have all read them.
All right, well, if you have no questions, it's very quick and to the point. If you've got no questions for me, there's no point in me summarising and simply repeating to you effectively what you've already read. So if that's the case, I think the appropriate thing is for me to call the first witness, who's Mr. Fearabend. Now the witnesses have also, of course, provided their evidence in writing, but I'll turn to Mr. Fearabend and let him address you.
Good morning, Commissioners.
Mr. Fearabend, you too have gone to some trouble in presenting evidence in a written statement, as we hoped you would, and we do offer our thanks to you for having done that so thoroughly and carefully. Is there some material that you would like to add, or is there some points that you would wish to take us to in particular? Because again, we don't need to ask you to read them to us because we've read them all.
I think
any updating needed?
I don't think there's any updating needed. I think the issues that are live are reasonably clear in terms of the evidence I have prepared and the impacts, I guess, on the Waitaki Power Scheme. And I'm quite happy to answer any questions that members of the panel may have with respect to that evidence and provide any additional detail that may be necessary.
I wondered whether there was something further that you were wanting to say about the fish passage material from starting at paragraph 41. Okay. See, when I read it first, I underlined a few of those statements, and I thought that maybe you'd be wanting to explain that a little bit further for us.
I guess from Meridian's perspective, policy 4.102 in terms of fish passage has some implications in the context of the structures that make up the Manapuri Power Scheme with respect to the Aviemore and Benmore OHAU
Yes.
systems.
You just mentioned the Manapuri Power Scheme, but I'm not sure that that's our topic, is it? The Manapuri Power Scheme, is that
No.
Hearing that you've got coming up?
No, the issue in relation to the Manapuri Power Scheme is just using that as an example of trap and transfer, where effectively barriers to tuna passage have been mitigated effectively through a trap and transfer process where alvars are collected below the primary structure in the Waiau River, transferred into Lake Manapuri and Lake Te Anau, and then a similar system is in place for the transfer of migrants, where they're captured in the lake at the time of their migration patterns and released below the structure. Now, a similar program is run in Waitaki, in that alvars are collected below the Waitaki Dam, and they are transferred in accordance with protocols agreed with Ngāi Tahu, and migrants again are captured and released. But I guess the reference point in terms of the Waiau was just to show there are alternatives to fish passage other than building things into existing structures. And in terms of the Waitaki scheme, in terms of Benmore and Aviemore, structures were attempted to be established on those structures, but were unsuccessful. And as a consequence, and as an alternative, trap and transfer is now the perceived best practice to assist tuna being able to go through its life cycle in the Waitaki system.
Commissioner Solomon, is there anything you'd like to ask the witness about that?
Yes, and I do intend asking the iwi group when they're before us as well. But do you have a letter of support from Ngāi Tahu to that the trap and transfer method of is preferred by them, or is it the only method available to them?
Well, currently, Mr. James might be able to talk to this more effectively than I can, but effectively there are arrangements and agreements with Ngāi Tahu, and they've been consulted, and in the Waitaki system actually participate and carry out the trap and transfer process with respect to migrants on our behalf.
Is there any method available to them though? Is there no other method to ensure the safe passage of tuna?
That is a preferred and agreed method of transfer at this stage, because you think of alva recruitment. Basically, when they reach the Waitaki Dam, it's a significant barrier and structure that effectively impedes alva being able to pass up into the system. So there were some early attempts to facilitate that passage through different means on the structure, but that proved to be unsuccessful. And so this is now, as I said, seen to be the preferred method of transfer.
It seems kind of labour intensive to get a Ngāi Tahu team out there at that time of the year. It just seems labour intensive, and I wondered if a clever engineer had come up with a way that, a better way and a less labour intensive way to ensure the safe passage of tuna.
I'm not aware of any, and I guess that was one of the reasons of using the Waiau and the Manapuri scheme as an example, because that's a very successful program. As you say, it is labour intensive. We have people in play from basically the end of November through till the beginning of March, trapping alva and placing them through the catchment, and conversely we begin a program for migrant transfer in November and run that through to May in that catchment. In Waitaki it's a shorter period, but part of that's associated with the fact that the Waitaki scheme has been in place for a long time, and tuna numbers in that catchment are somewhat lower than they are in the Waiau catchment.
Well, that was going to lead me to my next question. Is the trap and transfer successful as far as survival of tuna is concerned? Is it successful? Like, what percentage, what success rate is there?
Again, it it is. I think it's fair to say that from Meridian's perspective and the Ngāi people who we consult with in relation to that program think it's successful. But I think it might be Mr. James, who is going to be available for questioning shortly. In terms of the actual success rate of that program, he's probably better equipped to answer that, in that he reports on that annually.
Thank you. That's what I want to ask about the trap and transfer. I have got other questions though for you, Mr. Fairburn. Page 7 in your evidence, paragraph 28, and I can appreciate your need to maintain the WPS infrastructure and having the easiest consent pathway to do this. In your sentence midway down the paragraph, and that says given these works are already occurring without adverse effects on the environment, how do you know there are no adverse effects if no assessment has been undertaken due to the permitted activity status? Paragraph 28.
Correct. I guess there's no known adverse effects that I'm aware of in terms of the types of works that are necessary to be undertaken in the context of the scheme. Again, most of these structures, as the plan is drafted at the moment, the IFSH goes right up to our structures, and the areas around those structures have been highly modified over time, and the types of works that are undertaken in those areas are what one would expect in terms of maintaining and repairing those structures. And of course, from time to time, water spilled down through those structures. In times of high flood, and So I guess what I'm saying, it's a highly modified environment. The types of works are what one would expect to be able to do if the plan change, maps, and rules were to stay as they were proposed. Then consenting processes would be required for those kinds of works that one would expect to be just day-to-day operational positions, and I don't. It's an assumption I've made that there's no adverse effects, and no one's pointed or suggested that those types of activities are having any kind of adverse effect on the environment.
Thank you, Mr. Fairburn. On page 8 at paragraph 34, and with the doc submission in mind where it talks about removing valuable habitat for Indigenous fish generally during river maintenance works, please describe the method Meridian uses to remove the pest weed Lagarosiphon?
Lagarosiphon?
Yeah.
So currently there's two primary methods of removing Lagarosiphon. One method involves effectively poisoning it through using a chemical that affects the weed but doesn't affect the animals and creatures that live in the water. And that's done a couple of times a year. And then there's another program where material is actually cut, and effectively a vacuuming type of system is used to suck the material up and remove it from the waterway.
Okay, so where's the material put when it's removed from the waterway?
That's a good question, and I'm not able to answer it off the top of my head. But I assume that it's removed and disposed of appropriately.
Okay. At paragraph 39, and it kind of confused me. I want to know, with regard to rule point 163, where the activity rule changes to restricted discretionary, because I've got in front of me and it's still saying permitted.
I think in the way it's drafted, it's, I'd have to get the rule.
One six 5.164 is restricted discretionary, but not 163.
So the change to condition 7 effectively would mean that it's no longer permitted, because it talks about vegetation clearances not occur
And crocodile
in blah blah
habitat.
Schedule 17 in any analogous spawning
Threatened
habitat for the period
species.
of first year, or in any indigenous freshwater
Okay.
species habitat area.
Okay.
So that's
Thank
where
you.
the switch comes on
Yes.
and transfers you to another
Yes.
consent
No,
type.
I see it now. Thank you. That's all questions from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Van Voort, is there any questions for this witness?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. The Section 42A report recommends some changes to Schedule 17, the salmon spawning sites. Does that meet Meridian's concern?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so that's that one. Now, not questions for you, but questions for the Environment Canterbury officers. I see no changes were recommended to the Schedule 6 bathing sites in response to Meridian's submissions. So when you come to do your reply report to us, can you address that and particularly refer to the evidence that Meridian has now provided that you wouldn't have had available in your 42A report? And just a query from the officers, have any amendments been made to the IFSH mapping in response to Meridian's submission?
In response to power schemes in general, there was a 40-metre buffer change to the mapping.
Does that meet Meridian's concerns?
No, it doesn't. We have provided mapping in my evidence as an alternative, and that evidence has been generated off the back of discussions I've had with our asset engineers in terms of the spatial area, which I'll call the working footprint of the scheme.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. So again, to the officers in reply, can you make sure you return to that point for us in light of the evidence received? And not a question for you, but I certainly understand the issue that you raise about the relationship between Section 15, the Waitaki water quality limits, and Schedule 8. So I understand the issue you've raised, but no questions or clarification in that regard. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. Fairbairn, again, we're grateful to you for the clear presentation of your evidence and for answering our questions. Thank you for coming in this morning.
Thank you.
Do we come to Mr. James next?
Yes, Dr. James is the next witness, sir.
Dr. James, thank you. Just a moment. Good morning, Dr. James. Thank you for your statement that you provided us with. Is there anything that you need to add today by way of updating or correcting?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. No, nothing additional to add. Maybe one or two of the questions that have come up I might be able to expand a little bit on, but other than that, nothing specific.
Would you like to do that first before we come to any additional questions we might have for you?
Certainly. So there were questions around the ELVA and migrant transfer programs. There's ongoing reviews of these approaches. As Mr. Ferraband mentioned, we've done extensive reviews when we've been working on the WRRP system and Manapuri to look at the best methods of getting these animals past structures. And the trap and transfer certainly seems to be the most successful one based on those. And it's the system that's been in use for a little while in the Waitaki. And we're constantly looking at improving that, looking at the locations that the elvers are collected that are trying to get up through the system, and where the migrants are collected and taken down. And it's also important, obviously, where those elvers are put. And there was a question around the success of this, which is a very good question. We've got encouraging evidence now starting to come through in the WRRP that we're starting to see cohorts coming through that would relate closely to the age that we would expect for the ones that have been transferred up there through the program. And in the Waitaki system, it's very well, opportune time in a way, but we've just had a full survey done of tuna in the whole catchment in conjunction with Ngāi Tahu to look at where the eels are above the dams and the age structure to see if there is cohorts coming through and whether it is related to improved populations. I've just got that came through last night, so I haven't had a chance to have a look at it, but we will be using that to look at the success of the transfer program. What's also encouraging is that I know that they did collect some eels, smaller eels in parts of Benmore. These small, very small elvers are transferred mostly up into one of the arms of the Lake Benmore, the Ahuriri, which is a bit of a reserve and of real interest to Ngāi Tahu, so that's a key site. And they've found some of those have managed to get through Benmore and are going up into the Ohau as well, upper Ohau River. So the indications are success, and shortly we will have a lot more information to judge that success. At the same time, we're looking at, is the system we've got there the most efficient? Certainly the trap and transfer for these large dams seems to be the best way to get them up. You know that you're collecting them, you know where they're going, you knowing that they're getting up there, and you're not just relying on pipes that may be quite inefficient.
I could imagine hands-on's always better.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm pleased to hear that it's heading towards a successful outcome. I do have a couple of other questions for you, Mr. James, if you don't mind. Page 5, paragraph 17 of your evidence. Irrespective of the conservation status of Indigenous fish, do you not think that at risk, declining, or uncommon means the same as vulnerable, endangered, or threatened?
They are classified differently. Threatened in the threatened list includes those that are threatened, nationally critical, vulnerable, another category which I can't think offhand, endangered, and then we go down into the at-risk ones. And so the ones that are clearly endangered, those top three categories, which are classified as threatened as opposed to at risk, clearly there are issues nationwide and in a number of regions with those. For example, some of the fish species, one of the galaxids is only found in the Waitaki and in a few small streams, so clearly critical to protect those areas and those populations. With the ones that have been added that are at risk, I'd note that the likes of the freshwater mussel, even though it is declining, It's still classified, if you look at the most recent information on that, as common and widespread throughout New Zealand. And so, yes, I think we need to continue to protect and look after the habitats, but it is not at the same risk, obviously, as those other ones that are classified as threatened.
Okay. At your paragraph 8, paragraph 31 on page 8, you make the distinction between mussel habitat and important mussel habitat. I'm not sure whether this was deliberate or not, but what criteria have you used to identify what is important and what is not? Or am I reading too much into that?
Possibly, but I think it's an interesting point, and that there's a number of habitats that these mussels, you may only get the odd ones, or they don't survive very well in. They don't do well in cobbles, gravels, cliff faces, and those sort of things. They're actually present in the sand or fine or mud itself. They don't like a lot of fine silt around them. So you will get some in a number of habitats, but the really good habitat, which is clean sand on gentle sloping areas, is probably the more important one. And I think for these particular species, what's most important is the areas where you get the juveniles, the very small ones, which are very hard to find. But the times that I've found those have been in fine, clean sand. So that's the ideal habitat and probably the most important one in terms of these. But they tend to occur across a range of habitats. It's just some are more important maybe for juveniles, which is actually not a lot of information on, as opposed to the adults, which can be found anywhere between sort of 2 and 15 metres in these lakes. So often they're not seen, but they're there. They're down much deeper.
So with regard to the life cycle of kākahi, do they not depend on other fish to carry their eggs and their gills? So it wouldn't just be kākahi that would be protected in that situation, it would be the interdependent relationship with other species.
Yes, that's a very good point. I mean, it's an interesting animal in that it releases these little larvae that hang on to a fish as a parasite, and then they develop before they drop off and survive in the sand. So having host fish there is extremely important. We used to think koaro was the main species that they attach to, although they have been found on a range of fish species. Certainly some of the galaxids and koaro in particular are ideal hosts for them. So if you don't have those fish there, then there's no reproductive ability for that population. So it's important to have those host fish there as well. So protecting those host fish and making sure they're in those habitats is just as important. And that brings in a whole lot of other factors that affect fish. But they've also been found on common bullies. I've seen them on common bullies, and these common bullies are found in all these lakes. They're common. So there are opportunities there for fish. Perhaps the loss of koaro in an environment would be of concern because they're perhaps one of the best hosts. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. James.
Dr. James, just one question from me. I understand how you might avoid potential adverse effects on kākahi habitat. You just avoid undertaking any disturbance of that habitat. But is it possible to either mitigate or offset adverse effects on kākahi habitat?
Yes, you can. I think in these lakes, if you're disturbing the natural sediment, then that re-equilibrates. These things are pretty hardy, generally, certainly the older ones, and will survive for quite some time. Even in the air, they will survive for several days. So they are pretty hardy. Ironically, removing thick weeds that might develop in these lakes is a good way to improve the habitat for mussels. They tend to be found around weed beds, but certainly not in them. So if you've got an invasive macrophyte, for example, weed species coming in, particularly an aggressive one like Lagarosiphon, and a few of the species we don't have in the South Island at the moment, keeping those out and controlling them is also an important mitigation to avoid loss of some of the habitat through all these extensive weed beds that create all sorts of problems for the likes of mussels. Generally, these lakes have physical systems that tend to re-equilibrate themselves. So if you disturb the sediment, it'll settle out, and then within a few days or next time there's a bit of a blowout, it'll recirculate them, and a lot of the fine sediment ends up deep down in the lake where these mussels aren't found. They have tried recolonising or rehabilitating lakes like the one in Hamilton, and there's active transplanting going on at the moment to try and get them back into some lakes. But if you've got good clean sand and shallow zones, as I say, 2 to 10 metres is the ideal habitat for them. So weed clearance in these lakes is an important aspect for not just for Kākahi, but the general state and health of these systems.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Dr. James, again, our thanks to you for the care you've taken in preparing the statement and answering the questions.
Thank you.
We come to Ms. White now.
Yes, Ms White is the final witness for Meridian.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. White.
Good morning.
Thank you for preparing your statement. Is there any correction or updating to be done before we come to the questions?
No correction. The only thing I'd like to update is just to advise to the panel that subsequent to my evidence being provided, I have reviewed it in light of the National Policy Statement, the 2020 for freshwater management. And I am still confident that the matters contained in my evidence accord with that. So I'd just like to record that I have done that evaluation and analysis to check that there was nothing that was then untoward or out of synchronisation.
Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Ms. White?
No questions. The evidence is clear. Thank you.
Commissioner Solomon, any questions for this witness?
I've just got one.
Thank you.
And it is about Te Mana o Te Wai, looking ahead and at giving effect to Te Mana o Te Wai, particularly with regard to the hierarchy of obligations. One, the health and well-being of water bodies and freshwater ecosystems in particular. Would you support the entire lake being mapped as a critical habitat for Indigenous fish species for Kākahi and their symbiotic relationships?
No. In terms of my evidence, I don't, but I'm basing that on the evidence of Dr. James. I have no basis of that, but the evidence of Dr. James was that it wasn't the entire lake where those species are. I think for me the important thing with the entire lake is not necessarily how it's mapped, but it's then also the consequence of the mapping and how that is considered and what the implications of that are. So I'll probably temper my answer about not mapping the entire lake because it is dependent on what the then consequence of that mapping is, because it may be that the mapping is important to show its habitat, but I have probably more of an issue with then the consequence of that and how that comes through the rules and the provisions.
That's it from me.
Well, again, thank you, Ms. White, for the preparation and careful attention to detail that you always show, and we value that, and thank you for your evidence.
Thank you.
Is there anything further, Mr. Christensen, that you'd like to say by way of closing the case?
No, the process, Sue, is ruthlessly efficient, and so I think that the submissions and the evidence, we've endeavoured to address the matters clearly and fully in advance of the questions that you've had. So we appreciate very much the panel's attention to the material that's been provided, and thank you for that. And I've nothing further to add in support of Meridian's submission. Thank you.
Well, I just hope you don't feel that our aim for efficiency, because of the numerous submissions that we have, has in any way prejudiced your position. Is there anything, because if there's anything further you wish to take time on, it's not that we're begrudging your time.
No, so appreciate that. I think the issue that Ms White raised in response to Commissioner Solomon's question about the mapping of the lake is an important one. So the issue of the extent of the mapping is a matter which I do raise in submissions, and I say in terms of best drafting practice, in my submission the mapping should be accurate, and we shouldn't be mapping areas where we know the species that we're concerned about are not present. That seems to be inappropriate to me. But that's not Meridian's primary issue. Meridian's primary issue is addressed through making sure that the relevant policy and rule framework is favourable to its concerns, or addresses its concerns. So the way that Ms White has addressed it in her evidence effectively means that if the policy and rule are worded appropriately, then there's less concern with the extent of the mapping. And that's really how the balance between those matters works.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, of course, we've had the new NPS on our desks now for a month only, and the more we think about it, there may be room for further responses. But in the meantime, we have an understanding of where Meridian's position is. Yes. And we're grateful to all four of you for coming in this morning and for presenting in the way that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, am I right thinking that the next submission to be heard this morning is the Canterbury District Health Board?
Yes, that's correct. We don't have anyone representing the Canterbury District Health Board in the room at the moment, though.
Has someone been in today?
No.
Well, have they given you any indication that they might come to give us some help today?
I've heard nothing from them.
Well, I think it's a pity, because we had some questions which I foreshadowed yesterday in discussion with Mr. Moore. We had some questions that they might have been able to help us with concerning the drinking water standards, but probably Ms. Edwards will have that in hand in any event. So, which is the next submitted that we should be expecting to hear from this morning, please, Ms. Fernando?
We've got SOL Screening and Crushing and Lands and Survey South Limited, who have been rebranded to Elrick and Co.
So is that a joint presentation of the two?
Yes, that's correct. And we've got Mr. Headley here.
Thank you. I'll just bring up their submission. Now, who's going to represent these submitters?
Mr. Headley, he's just stepping up now.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Headley. Thank you so much for coming in.
Good morning.
It's very
Good morning. Mr. Chair, Commissioners, thank you for taking the time to hear from my client and from myself. As has been advised, Lands and Survey South was rebranded as a company Elrick and Co Limited on the 1st of April 2020, 5 days into COVID. Level 4 was probably not ideal, but that decision was made back in January.
Just give me the new name again, would you please?
Elrick, E-L-R-I-C-K, and
Yes.
Co.
And Co.
And Co.
And that's in place of Land and Survey South.
That's correct.
And SOL Screening and Crushing is a separate business, is it?
It is. It is a client of ours. It is a company involved in quarrying, gravel extraction, gravel
Yes.
processing.
Splendid.
Now, I have an apology, and that is for the late submission of a statement of evidence. And I'm wondering if that has been distributed to yourself, Mr. Chair, and the committee.
Just let's see if we've got it. Well, I don't seem to have received that, Mr. Headley, and I'm sorry, I do apologise.
The apology is mine, sir. It comes from filing it on Monday.
All right. Well, it's possibly in the course of communication. Is it a lengthy statement?
I can summarise that statement.
Yes, that'd be a good idea if you wouldn't mind, please.
And I will provide a copy, a hard copy as well. There is an introduction with my credentials, which I will take as read by you at a later date. Confirmation that I'm familiar with the Code of Conduct for expert witnesses in the Environment Court, that the matters are within my area of expertise, and I would add to it that I have considered the terms of the new national policy statement.
Mr. Headley, forgive me for interrupting, but I have now found that I do have this statement. And it's all here. And so that will help you to take me through it, and my colleagues, if they have it already. Commissioners, do you have Mr. Headley's statement?
Yes, we do, sir.
Like you,
Yes.
I've just found mine.
So thank you very much, Mr. Headley. That I think will make it easier for us to follow your summary.
Certainly. The first issue raised by my clients relates to the removal of the wording excluding the diversion of water within the bed of a river from Rule 5.149. 5.149 refers to very minor gravel extractions as a permitted activity. And associated with that, there may well be some minor diversions of water. The rule does not allow for the range of flow rates in South Canterbury rivers. And while I accept that the Canterbury Regional Gravel Management Strategy does not control the diversion of water, consideration of the effects of the diversion of water is made by ECAN river engineers on a case-by-case basis during an assessment and approval of gravel availability in the bed of a river. So our clients are looking at individual small sections of river to take gravel, often for localised roading projects, construction, civil construction. Our concern is that the removal of that section of the rule may have implications for them on their day-to-day operation. I'll then move to Rule 5.141.
Yes.
This provides for a change to the measurement of any sediment that may be discharged in a temporary manner from the works, and is particularly onerous in terms of its requirement for measurement. In order to fully comply with that rule, it may well mean that our client is required to employ a full-time environmental consultant on each and every river site. All right, accept Council's officers' argument that there are simplified methods that have been developed to overcome the constraints with community monitoring in small streams. However, our clients are working in a challenging environment in a full range of weather conditions in the outdoors, operating large loader and crushing equipment, and to then expect them to continually monitor minor sediment discharges with any degree of accuracy is, I think, just simply unrealistic and outside of the context of the practical reality of what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And it moves away from the more accepted norm of a discharge for not more than 10 hours in a 24-hour period and not more than 40 hours in a total calendar month. And these operations run from 7 a.m. till 6 p.m, 6 days a week, usually. And I did note that the Council's planner, in preparing Section 42A report, did note that the measurement of sediment, suspended sediment in the discharge is excessive in relation to the activities managed under Rules 5.141, 5.152. That was based on technical evidence that she received. I also question, with regard to that rule, the ability of that rule to be enforced and the difficulty for council enforcing that rule. My evidence then moves to Rule 5.136. My clients, as part of their work in rehabilitating a site post-gravel extraction, often create delta or islands in the river as part of that work. I don't believe the Land and Water Plan provides an alternative rule which would enhance those activities. And therefore I consider them less likely to occur. My clients and our company are committed to river habitat enhancement, and it's not inconsistent with standard gravel extraction policies and procedures. The last point of my evidence relates to the accuracy of the mapping. My concern there is that we simply don't have enough information. There are continual updates and changes to ECAN GIS mapping, and that's applauded, but it makes it increasingly difficult for our clients with those changes occurring. When council limits the duration of gravel extraction consents to 12 months, every 12 months they're reapplying for a consent, even in the same water body, for the same activity. And we understand and agree with the reason for that. It relates to avoiding land banking of gravel. One party tying up gravel for years without using it in a river. But with the changes, with the inaccuracies at the moment, particularly with regard to indigenous freshwater species habitat, and incremental changes to that mapping, it makes it increasingly difficult for ourselves as consultants and our clients to have any accuracy with regard to where they're going, how they're going, and what conditions we need to liaise with council on. We do find from time to time, that there are significant changes from one year to another, which which aren't totally transparent in the manner in which the database is being updated. Now, my clients support the submissions of road metals as it relates to the provisions of site-specific monitoring data for groundwater levels, and in particular the suggestion by Road Metals Limited of a 5-year term for monitoring data for a specific site. They also oppose the imposition of a rehabilitation plan in the land and water plan. That rehabilitation is part and parcel of their consenting works. It becomes a condition of consent rather than a rule in the plan. And it's more appropriate because of the diverse nature of river sites from the Clarence, Waiatau in the north through to the Waitaki in the south, that individual consent conditions set that site remediation or rehabilitation rather than a rehabilitation plan under a rule in the plan. There is a health and safety matter that also comes out in the install of a culvert, as referenced by Fulton Hogan in their submission 428. A 10-metre culvert length is not necessarily sufficient for health and safety purposes in some of the rivers. There's no disagreement with the proportion of culvert to be buried and for the allowance of fish passage. It's simply that there are some braided rivers where a 10-metre culvert will not allow access, and culverts in gravel extraction, to be a permitted activity, are temporary. They're 4 weeks in nature without a specific consent. I'll close my submission, my evidence and submission there, Mr. Chair, committee members, and ask if you have any questions with regard to it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Headley. Commissioner Van Fort, is there any questions of Mr. Headley?
Yes, thank you. Just a couple. Mr. Headley, I assume that in Canterbury, the same as in most other regions in New Zealand, gravel extraction does not occur in flowing water within rivers?
That's correct.
So the only activity affecting flowing water that might be of concern to gravel extractors would be those associated with access to a site? If they had to cross a little branch of a braided river, for example, to get to a beach? Or
No, some apologies, no. Yes, if they do have to cross a flow channel to get to a delta or an island, yes. But these rivers are dynamic. It's essential that, in taking the gravel, both the plant equipment, stockpiles, the surge piles, are placed in a position where they're not subjected to flow events. So it's the dynamics of the river on each individual site is monitored by the site foreman on a daily basis, and they work very closely with the site staff from the regional council on the location of their plant equipment and their stockpiles of material. There are rules relating to the alignment of stockpiles to mitigate their transport downriver. And if I can just say from a commercial perspective, the gravel industry only gets paid for the stones that are loaded in the truck. So if it's stockpile sitting in the river and it goes out to sea, they don't get paid for it. Just commercially. Sorry, thank you.
Right, so Rule 5.141 and condition 3 that you're concerned about, these officers have recommended reinstating the original words that were crossed out by the plan change, but adding in, as you've pointed out, reference to Schedule 5 visual clarity standards.
Yes,
I understand that addition is the basis of your concern.
it is.
Other submitters have suggested qualifying that particular condition by adding the words outside the mixing zone, so that the Schedule 5 visual clarity standards would only apply outside of a mixing zone. Would that go any way to meeting your concerns?
It would go a long way to meeting our concerns. I think there is something to think here. When you're extracting in the bed of a river, you may be 10 metres from a flow channel, but that flow channel will seep through both ways. So it will create a small pond, which gravel is extracted from, but it may also seep the other way back through. The 10-metre buffer is mitigating that flow into a flow channel, but there will be some sediment flow into that flow channel, and it cannot be avoided.
No? Okay, thank you very much for that.
Commissioner Solomon, any questions of Mr Headley?
Yes, I just have one question. I'm just trying to find it. Your support for the Fulton Hogan submission at number D, where they are opposing a rehabilitation site plan be prepared to address any potential adverse effects. Clean fill. If the clean fill included asbestos, for instance,
No.
wouldn't you want to make sure it doesn't affect flora and fauna?
Clean fill can't include asbestos. That part of that submission relates to quarrying activities rather than strictly river works. Seoul also has a quarry. The quarry there accepts clean fill, so it sells gravel and takes in clean fill. It's required to keep a 1 metre separation between the highest groundwater level and the base of the excavation. The clean fill meets the MFE guidelines relating to clean fill. It cannot include more than 3% vegetative matter. It cannot include asbestos, plastic, or anything that may leach to groundwater. So it's clean material, rock, stone, aged and cured asphalt, which doesn't leach, brick that doesn't leach. The rehabilitation plan, rather than being included in a rule in the plan, is more appropriate to be part of a consent condition where it can be tailored to an individual quarry pit rather than attempt to capture it by a rule in the plan.
Thank you.
Any further questions, Commissioners?
No, not for me.
No, thank you.
Right, thank you. Well, Mr Headley, we're very grateful to you for having taken the trouble to prepare this statement, and coming in to answer our questions with your summary. Thank you very much indeed.
Not a problem. Thank you very much.
So I think the next submissions that we come to are the submissions of Winter and Sons.
Yes, that's correct. We've got David Winter and Des Winter here.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Would you like to come forward to the desk? Now, gentlemen, which of you is going to speak first?
Yeah, probably me. I'm
Yes,
Dave Winter.
Yes.
This is my father,
Thank you
Des.
very much. Splendid. Now, we have received, in fact, three separate submissions representing your business, and I take it that you're addressing all three of them together, are you?
Yeah, pretty well. Yep.
Pretty well?
Yep.
Excellent. Well, if you would like now just to proceed to address the submissions, you don't need to read them out to us because we've got them before us and we've read them.
Rightio then, Mr. Chairman. I'll formally introduce myself. I'm Dave Winter. I'm a farmer from Kaipoi. I've been doing it for about 20 years, ever since I left school. With me also today is my father, Des. He's also a farmer. He's pretty much put his lifetime's effort into the property we farm now. His farming experience goes back to 1967, so he's been doing it for 53 odd years. So he likes to call himself qualified by experience.
Yes.
WJ Winter and Sons itself was probably formed in the late 60s. However, it dates back to probably the late 40s when my grandfather left dairy farming and started market gardening, growing potatoes and onions. To this day, we still grow potatoes, so that legacy has continued. Today we farm 260 hectares. Our properties are based over 4 different locations. The 2 historical blocks date back to my grandfather's purchases, and then in the last 10 years, me and my brother came on board and we purchased another couple of blocks. Also to that, WJ Winter and Sons owns a quarter of a dairy farm in Swananoa, Nightly Limited. It also made a submission, however we're not here to talk about much of that today, but if anything dairying comes up and integrated into our thing, you'll probably know our background. So I know both sides of the story. That's probably enough about the background and the history. First thing I'll probably comment on, I didn't actually submit on it, but the vegetable growing rules that Hort NZ have proposed and ECAN, I'm just very interested to see how they may apply to me, being part arable farmer, part horticulture farmer, part livestock farmer. In terms of the vegetable growing rules allow for a consent to be for a property, so it doesn't seem to have any nitrate conditions attached to it. So with me growing 20 hectares of potatoes over my 260 hectares, pretty much that being about 8% of my property, but I can't grow potatoes in the same ground every year, and I probably need an 8 to 10 year rotation. So do I need to get a consent for that part of my business and then also get a land use consent for the other part of my business? It just seems to be very complicated and duplication, and I'm just not really sure where I may fit in. And I'm not sure how that would fit into the nitrate priority map for WIMAC in terms of the reduction areas, with there being no conditions attached to that either in terms of a nitrate loading under the vegetable growing consent rules. So that's probably my only comments and concerns around that side of things. Probably my next comment I'd like to make would be the WIMAC Zone Committee and the Zipper findings. I mean, I know me and my father probably attended 20 to 30 meetings, probably dating back 5 years. The Zipper I thought had quite good consultation on, and there were some good things achieved by that process. However, when the Plan Change 7 was published, there were a lot of left field things that we had never been consulted on, and I don't think the community had their input like it should have, probably especially around the map, the nitrate priority map and the subzones. They were pretty much left field, and I felt they were very dividing for the community and didn't send the right messages. I mean, we all know we need to reduce in a way, but I don't know that that was going to achieve the right outcomes. So that's probably my comments on that. In terms of my submission, I still have very mixed concerns around the use of horticulture to model arable and horticulture crops and the complex rotations. That combined with the ECAN's portal pretty much puts us out of business in terms of we probably cannot meet the GMP number that PC5 gives us. My consultant tells me that it's due to us having heavy soils, which I thought was a really good thing because nice good heavy soils don't leach as much anyway, so I'm not really sure where that one comes from. We also run travelling irrigators as opposed to the centre pivots or that. I have got one big lateral irrigator. However, I think the travelling irrigators are far better than a pivot in a cropping situation because I can set the irrigator up to run on that crop when it needs a demand rather than running the pivot over the whole thing and just wetting everything when some crops at that stage don't really need the water. And cultivation was another thing that the portal was flagging us for, so I'm not really sure how you can grow potatoes by direct drilling them. And I think the complex cropping rotations were just mucking with overseer and that too. I don't think it was designed for cropping, so I'm not really sure that that's the best approach for those sort of things. I'm not going to delve into too many details and numbers, but I will say our baseline is around 45 and our GMP number is 22. I have no idea how I'm going to meet this, and effectively the only option I see for our business to continue is for common sense to apply, or we will become a property developer and join the rest of our neighbours in the 10-acre game, I guess you would call it. I will make comment now that our dairy farm in Swananoa, we only purchased it 2 years ago, so we were not farming it in the baseline period. However, this guy was one of those idiots that should have been crucified. He was running a baseline of 140. The GMP number there takes it back to 110. So I'm not really sure where the evenness in that is when I'm at 45 anyway and I have to go down to 22. I'm not sure I made the huge impact for a start. However, I'm being dealt the full effect of the rules. The other thing I will make comment, I don't really know how much we could lower or what we can change to lower our nitrate leaching number. I mean, we've got a lateral irrigator, we could probably put another one of them in. Pretty much with cropping, fertiliser in equals yield out. I thought it was a fairly simple system. If I look at the Waimak Irrigation's forward report, it pretty much said that the cropping farmers or arable guys were broke by 2030. That's not a very good thing to be sitting here staring down when I'm meant to be the good years of my farming career, rather than the twilight years as my father calls them he's in now. The other thing I may make comment around is groundwater. We've got consents for 3 groundwater takes. The actual use actually worries me as being one of the conditions, because currently we're cropping farmers, we're growing cereals, so they die off around Christmas time, so we don't have the high water demand of growing pasture right the way through. So if I decide there's some new found crop and I'm capped to my current use when I go for my new consents, it pretty much limits my future activities, so I'm not really sure that that's a good outcome for anyone, because I mean we don't know what crops on the horizon or around the corner. I will make comment that our dairy farm last season used 500 millimetres of irrigation. Our cropping side of the business we probably used 200 to 300 mils, so our water use was a lot less. So that's probably all I've got to say about groundwater. Other than that, we pretty much need to not change too much in terms of that, because we don't know what Mother Nature's going to throw at us in terms of climate change and all those different effects. We may find that we're irrigating longer than we have been previously. Surface water, we've got 2 takes to take surface water out of the Kaiapoi River and the Courtenay Stream. We've had the Courtenay Stream site since 1968, so that's 52 years. That site is actually tidal, so the water level goes up and down with the tide when the floodgates are shut on the Kaiapoi River. So pretty much like the amount we're taking is pretty much shouldn't even be subject to a low flow, as there's nowhere for it to flow to in terms of that site. The Kaiapoi River one, however, we've had since 1979, so that's 40 odd years. We've only been on low flows once ever apparently, and I still to this day do not see how that could get down to the level that Ecan headed at, as our drives around that river, and I've driven past it pretty much every day for the last 30 odd years. So that's probably, I'm not impressed with the way the low flows are being moved up. I don't think that there's going to be much achieved in terms of that. I think the effects are probably more up further, because as we're at sea level, the water doesn't really, the groundwater level is connected to it, but I don't think the bit we're taking at our site is actually going to have much of an impact. I think the effects are from further up the plains. Which brings me to my next topic, which is TSA and MAR. I know their uses in terms of dilution is the solution. I can't argue with that. However, the impacts of MAR on our property may turn it back to an absolute swamp and bog, which will make it pretty much unfarmable and will increase our runoff in terms of when it does rain, because pretty much like anything, if your bathtub's half full from underneath, it doesn't take much for it to start overflowing. Our current water table is probably around 2 metres deep below our farm. So if you're going to pour more water in up the Swannanoa type areas like Waimak Irrigation and others have proposed, I need some really good assurances that it's not going to be done when we have these so-called wet years and the undercurrents and those sort, and our springs really start flowing, because it pretty much makes our farm unfarmable and turns it back to a wetland, which I probably shouldn't say, or Dave Parker will want to take the whole thing off me. The other thing I would like to say would be consent timeframes, where I see we're heading to 10 years. 10 years is probably a bit short to make business decisions around in terms of investment and in infrastructure and irrigation. I know most banks run on 20-year loans in terms of their thing, so I know that everything has to review with a plan, but I think I need assurances that if I'm going to do something, I can continue to be allowed to do it all very well. The conditions may alter slightly. So the other thing I might like to make point to is pretty much the only alternative land use I see for our properties is subdivision. In terms of the water quality effects, nothing grates me more than to go past these lifestylers and see them brilliantly green oases that they are, overwatering their gardens and paddocks with pretty much unregulated activities. Also, they have a separate tank that they're disposing of wastewater into the ground. Surely this is discharging some nitrate or something. These are pretty much also unregulated. Probably the other thing that really bites me is I pretty much like to think myself as a fairly good farmer, and I've got a fairly tidy property and run a good ship. However, a lot of my lifestyle friends seem to have horses and cattle and everything running in their streams and the waterways, the little gutters that we've got dug between us. And I mean, Des will tell you, we've tidied up a couple of 3 of them on our boundaries, cleaned them out. Next thing, they've got their stock running back in them, complete disregard. I'd like to see some rules put in amongst them too, so we're all on an even footing. In terms of the NPS on high value soils, I think we've probably our farmers probably some of the best you're going to find in Canterbury. So I'm pretty near sure that the policy on that from national government was to sort of protect and provide some framework to continue that land use. In terms of horticulture, I thought that was meant to be the way forward as opposed to animal proteins and dairying. However, the rules currently set out in Plan Change 7 pretty much mean that our dairy farm can continue and our arable hort operation is significantly disadvantaged. Pretty much everything else, pretty much comes down to we're facing, as farmers, we're facing increased costs. The only way to pretty much stay still is to farm at a higher intensity, even though pretty much Plan Change 7 sets the mood to farm less intensively. I mean, at the end of the day, we're only price takers. We have pretty much minimal impact on how we can add value to our product. And summing up, I think farm environment plans are probably a better way rather than beefy rules, and probably common sense approaches and eyeballing farms and knowing what and where you're going wrong will probably deliver a better outcome than any paper written plan. Probably the only other thing I will comment on is the well-being of the farmers in the community. I mean, we're facing a lot at the moment. It's pretty tough going out there. I mean, unless you've got a fairly thick hide like me and are very determined and stubborn and are not going to give up on the dream that I had 20 odd years ago when I left school. However, there's a lot of other people out there that are a lot more fragile than me, so I think there probably needs to be a lot more regard given to that, because I mean, this plan and the new NPS rules push farmers to a place they've never been before. So that scares the shit out of me that I may be attending a funeral at some stage, and I really don't want that on anyone's conscience. I don't know if that pretty much sums up my piece. I don't know if Des wants to add anything from his 50 years of experience.
I think that that's a good idea. If we come to your father now, and then if we have some questions, either of you can answer them or both. Mr. Des Winter, thank you very much for coming in. And is there something that you would like to add to what your son has already told us so eloquently?
No, he's about summed it all up. But I should tell you what, as to say, my father was a dairy farmer back in the day, and he switched to vegetable growing, and he had 6 children, and 4 of his sons followed his footsteps and went farming, and we were trained right from day one. You're not here, fellas, to mine the land. You're here to look after the land so it can be farmed in the future. And I think now that I've got 3 children now, and one's on the dairy farm, the other 2 are farming with me, or I'm farming with them now, I think, and I've taught them the same thing. But the thing is, every time something comes out, on these rules and so forth, it just does my head in. And I just can't believe it. I told ECAN all these meetings we've been to, if we're going to farm under a computer model, we might as well give up, because you can never farm land by a computer model. I wouldn't have minded cutting back inputs to carry on farming. You would have brought your costs back a wee bit and we'd have carried on. But to farm by a computer model, we're just wasting our time. And the rules that David read out there before just tell you that what the dairy farm can roll on at to what we've got to do is just waste of time. So what he says is, hey, I wouldn't like to see our farm chunked up into housing, but I can see if we're going to keep going down the rules we are, that's what will happen. But I only hope that I pass on before I see that happening. Yeah. Yeah. So that's about all I can add.
Well, thank you. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of the Mrs. Winter?
Yeah, just a couple, thank you. You mentioned your baseline figure of 45 kgs of N per hectare per year. Can you live within that figure? Is that the figure that you're happy with, or are you unhappy with that one as well?
No, I think I can live with that one.
Okay.
That's got 200 units of N.
Yeah.
That's what we're applying. to our crops and pretty much everything else. Like that's the average over the whole farm. Some paddocks will have slightly more, some will have slightly less. I could live with that.
Okay. And you mentioned some minimum flow issues with relation to your surface takes, the Courtney stream. So I'm looking at table 8.2, and you mentioned the Kaipoi. Is that the same as the Silver Stream? Or
Yeah, the Kaipoi
okay.
Silver Stream
So
is
it's
the same river.
The same one. And you said...
I think our consent says Kaipoi, so that's why I've referred to it as
sure.
that.
And I think when we did our site visit, we were told that one flows into the other and there's interchangeable
Correct.
names. So with the Silver Stream, you mentioned...
The Silver Stream bisects our property.
Yeah, and you raised the issue of the proposed minimum flows for the Silver Stream, and I think you said you'd never seen it get as low as that. Was that... So do you have a concern with the minimum flow that's been set?
I probably have a concern that because pretty much everyone that's like the minimum flows that at the
Yeah.
moment we've got our historic consent, so we were first on, so we're last off.
Right.
So we're losing that position because like historic consent's first in, first served basis. So we were first in on that river, I guess you would say. So pretty much like I think the current flow is 900. Is it going to 1200 or something? But
Yeah.
pretty much they add everyone's take to it, and then we sort of go on restrictions.
Yep.
From there onwards.
Yeah.
So pretty much like at the moment our current cut-off I think is 600 or something.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Pretty much we're going to be cutting off at 1400 when you get everyone's low flow added in. We're going to be going on staged restrictions, I guess you would say.
Right.
So we're losing a lot there. So that probably doesn't impress me too much.
Yeah.
And in terms of that, I probably could have gone out 2 or 3 years ago and gone and got 50 litres a second off that river. But I told the consultant when we were redoing our consent, no, I don't need any more water. I've got enough at my 20. However, now I should have gone and asked for 50 litres a second. And even when we were on a 25, 30% take, we would have still had enough.
Yeah.
So I pretty much shot myself in the foot there.
Okay, so as I understand it, then your concern is with the partial restrictions regime whereby the allocation blocks are added to the minimum flow, and then when that level is hit, people start getting restricted. So,
Correct.
And that's new for you?
Yes,
Yeah.
because
okay.
we're pretty much at the historic, our consent is the historic one, so first on, last off.
Yeah. Okay, no, good.
Well, the other way around actually.
Yeah, okay, no, that's good. Thanks for clarifying.
So that makes a huge difference to us, and I mean,
Yeah.
I'm looking at everything else. Am I going to want to go and spend 100 grand drilling a well down 40, 50 metres to take some water that's just sitting right there that I'm looking at? And I mean, it's high nitrate water anyway, so it makes sense to take it out, put it on the land, use it, grow some crop.
Yeah. No, okay, good. Thank you.
And at the end of the day, I don't think the low flows are going to make any difference to anyone.
Why is
Really.
it? Why is that?
If we dug a hole next to the stream, I would say we'd get the water level would be higher than that stream in places. Would you say that, Des?
Sure, it would be.
Because I mean, our groundwater level is pretty much at like 2 metres anyway. That stream might be about that in the ground.
And
I've
if you-
never actually measured it, but I know it's about that far down.
Right.
And if you've seen the water, you just drink it tomorrow because it's just crystal clear, and they tell us it's bad. You would honestly drink it.
Yeah.
I used to swim in it, but it was too cold.
All right, that's great. Thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
Yes. Are you here representing JH Winter, KA Winter?
No,
No.
just WJ Winter and Sons Limited,
Okay.
and then Knightley Limited is our dairy farm, but I'm not really here representing them.
Okay. Then I have no questions, except to say that I support the vegan lifestyle, so I'd like to enable you to carry on growing vegetables.
Thank you for that. I'd like to do so too.
Yeah.
I think that's all our questions. Can I say how interesting it is for us to have you who have the practical experience come in to explain to us how you see the effect of the proposed rules and to explain the way in which it would affect the actual practical operation of your enterprises. Thank you very much for coming in.
I just like to make one more little comment. I'm not a skite, but you'd only have to drive up our driveway, and before you got to our yard, you would know straight away that we aren't wallies, and we're here to look after the land. Because everyone who
Yes.
comes in here it just straight out says, hey, what an operation you got. And there's, really speaking, there's nothing really out of place. We have put our heart and souls into it, you know. Yeah, but my heart's about gone. My heart's about gone.
Yes. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity. Good luck with the rest of the hearing.
Now, Ms. Fernando, is there further business this morning, or do we now break until later?
I've attempted to contact the Canterbury District Health Board and I got no response. So that's the last of the submitters for the morning session. So we've got...
All right, so what time do we start again for this afternoon?
2 o'clock.
2 o'clock.
That's New Zealand time, yeah.
Yeah, that's when we have McFarlane Agriculture.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. Well, we'll adjourn the hearing now until 2 o'clock this afternoon for McFarlane Agriculture and those submitters that follow this afternoon.